Last weeks and months, you've been hearing about the refugee crisis in Europe. We'll be talking about that in half an hour. But first, we're going to take you to the other side of the world, where refugees arriving by boat are often housed in offshore islands. Today, a Senate inquiry in Australia has called for all children to be removed from one of the government's asylum processing centres on the Pacific island of Nauru. It said the centre was not safe and called for a full investigation into allegations of sexual abuse and other crimes committed there. The report also called for proper access for human rights workers and the media. In just a moment, we'll hear from a senator who sat on the inquiry from the ruling Liberal Party of Prime Minister Tony Abbott. The inquiry has no legal underpinning and the government is under no obligation to follow its recommendations. Let's hear now, though, from Dr. David Isaacs. He is a paediatrician who was invited to Nauru to assess the children in the processing centre in December 2014, and he's given evidence to the Senate inquiry.
What I saw was a prison camp by any other name. So what you see is different bits of the camp, if you like. The living quarters are surrounded by fences and guards. It's not possible to go into the living quarters without having your mobile phone, camera, wallet all confiscated, and you get them again when you go out. You're not allowed to go round there without being accompanied by a guard, and the people sit around, children playing around in the dirt there. The people live in tents, and the tents are adjacent to one another, so there's absolutely no privacy. And in fact, guards can walk into the tents and do. The tents are about 30 to 120 metres from the toilet and wash facilities, so there's no running water inside the tents. And that is badly lit at night, so you run a gauntlet, if you like, under the eyes of guards if you want to go to the toilet at night. And many people would wet the bed rather than do that, adults as well as children, rather than run that gauntlet.
Dr. Isaacs, you're a paediatrician. Give us a sense of the treatment and the way in which children are living, children of the refugees, asylum seekers, how they are treated in the camp.
OK, so children live inside those tents. If they're under 5 years of age, there's a rudimentary air conditioning in the tent. If they're not under, there's no child under 5, the tents are not air conditioned, and those tents had mould. The conditions are dangerous for children, I think, in all sorts of ways. They're dangerous in terms of worries about gastroenteritis in that setting. You're in a Pacific island with poor health facilities. They're worrying in terms of safety, and so there's been a lot talked about child protection issues and children being abused on Nauru. It's a form of torture, in my view. It's tantamount to child abuse, and in fact, a number of paediatric bodies have called it child abuse.
Those are very, very strong words that you're using. What is it that you saw in particular? Can you give us, can you paint a picture of what you saw?
I was there to see children for consultation, children that they were worried about. And I saw about 30 children. All of the children came from extremely traumatised families. So I saw a 6-year-old who had tried to hang herself with a rope tie, a fence tie, and she had strangulation marks around her neck. I've never seen that in a 6-year-old before in all my 40 years of being a paediatrician. I saw a boy of 15 who sewed his lips together because he was so frustrated. That was his only way of protesting about what was happening. I saw deeply traumatized families. And so when I say that it's a form of child abuse, what is being done is that the authorities are trying to make Nauru more unpleasant than what the people have fled from. That's almost explicit. Okay? People may or may not quite admit that in government, but that's what it looks like there. And they're making it so horrible that it is tantamount to child abuse. The College of Physicians has called it that. The paediatricians have called it that. And so we think this is a form of child abuse. And what's more, children have actually been physically and sexually abused there, and it was covered up. In fact, the workers that said this was happening were dismissed, and they were said to be coaching the mothers, which turned out not to be true. And there was an inquiry called the Moss Report, which showed that children were being abused, and the people who'd been dismissed were wrongly dismissed.
You are a doctor who was invited onto Nauru. The Australian government passed an act in just this year, the Border Force Act, which says that anyone on a government contract of any sort, if they talk about what's happening on Nauru Island, they can go to jail for 2 years. You are aware of that. Why are you speaking out?
I'm speaking out because silence is to condone this. So, many people say to me, don't you face going to prison for 2 years? And what I say to that is, I'm prepared to go to prison for 2 years for this. I'm old enough, almost at retiring age now, that it's really not going to affect me. But the reason for the law, which is draconian in the extreme, it is something we'd expect from Russia or North Korea, not Australia. The reason for that law is clearly to silence protest, silence the truth. And that's a very dangerous precedent. So people like me who've seen what's happening have to speak out.
And as an Australian citizen, speaking out makes you think what about the country that you are living in now?
So, as you can hear, I'm English originally from my accent, I think. But I've been in Australia for 25 years. My wife's Australian. My children are Australian. And I'm proud of this country. But I'm not proud of this. I think what's being done in our name to asylum seekers is appalling.
Your observations on Nauru have had an impact on you personally, haven't they? It's really affected you.
Look, I have to say that both I and the nurse who went with me were deeply traumatised by what we saw. That sounds a bit over the top, overblown, but we both found we were having nightmares. We talked to each other and said, oh, my goodness, we're having nightmares afterwards. And it's caused me to become a whistleblower. So I've been working with refugee children. I run a refugee clinic at a tertiary children's hospital in Sydney, and I've been doing that for 10 years. But I've never been a vocal advocate for asylum seekers. But this, just witnessing what happened, shocked me and has made me speak out against my contract. Speak out and let people know what's happening, because they need to know graphically what it looks like to be on Nauru for these families.
That was paediatrician